Right.
Sorry, Martin.
Again, welcome. When I started in PowerShell 12 years ago, 13 years ago, I hoped that we get to this sort of position, and we got there. So if you've not met me before, Richard Siddaway, I wrote my first program in 1970, so you can probably take a guess as to which birthday it is. I've been working with PowerShell since the first beta of V1. I stumbled across it on a search for something else, and the rest is history. As Ryan said, I started the user group in January 2007 with Thomas Lee. That was the world's first PowerShell user group. I've done a lot of work with the PowerShell Summit. You may know my blog. I've done quite a bit of speaking and writing. And if you haven't bought the books, please do so. My children need to eat. And there may be another PowerShell book in the offing. I'm still trying to work out what I'm going to do. Now, keynotes. And you can probably guess where this quote's going. The wonderful thing about keynotes of things. And the reason for that is this is how it goes. You get an email that says, Richard, could you come and do the keynote? Yeah, I'd be honored to. What do you want me to talk about? Oh, anything you want. I promise to behave. Ish. Okay, so it's usually an invited speaker, usually regarded as an expert, but you've got me. Establish the theme, blah, blah, blah. So, let's actually add a little bit of controversy as well, maybe. Yeah? Does anybody not recognize this guy? Anybody? No? So you all know Jeffrey Snover. He invented PowerShell. I'll tell you a little Richard and Jeffrey story. There's a couple of people in the audience that were actually present when this happened. And I need to take your minds back to 2008. With Barcelona, TechEd, it was still running. And there was a PowerShell discussion panel. And we were talking about things in general, and I think something about PowerShell certifications came up. And I'm sat next to Jeffrey, so I'm on the end, there's Jeffrey here. And I said, PowerShell doesn't matter. The place went quiet. Jeffrey looked at me, and I then discovered what he meant by that phrase of his. He looked at me like I had a rat's tail hanging out of my mouth. Before he could actually resort to violence, I pulled it back by saying, it's what you do with it that matters. And the reason for this story is it leads in to what we're doing today. It's all about getting things done. So we've got a session on, or sessions on development, we've got DevOps, and we've got using PowerShell to get stuff done. And the organizers have already been mentioned, but I think they deserve another quick round of applause for the hard work. I know from experience how hard it is. And to iterate what was said, don't be that typical British techie that stands in the corner looking at the ground. Talk to people. I know it's not what we normally do, but talk to people. They may just have the answer to your problem. I've done a lot of work with the US Summit, I've been to the European Conference, and at each event, people have said that it's the ability to talk to people, the attendees, who have similar problems to them or have actually solved their problem. That's the biggest benefit. So take advantage of today. There's a lot of expertise in this room. Get your questions answered. It wouldn't be a PowerShell event without having some code. So rather than doing demos, I thought I'd just put a couple of things up. Just things that I've tripped over in the last few days. What's this going to give me? Because I was quite surprised when I got the result. It actually gives you 154. And the reason for that is that your range is actually 0, -1, -2. And if you think of array indices, -1 is the last one, -2 is the penultimate one. So just be careful with ranges. You can get not quite the results you thought. Right, PowerShell, where are we? We've had the product since November 2006. We've gone through 6, 7 versions of it, and we have got a very large community. Was anybody in the audience, apart from James, who was at TechEd 2006 when PowerShell was announced? No? So you've all come into PowerShell since then. Just out of quick interest, anybody start with version 1? 2? A lot more. 3? 4? 5? Anybody start with 6? Well, okay. It's about what I thought. So if we have a quick look at where we've come from. PowerShell version 1 through 5, all based on the Monad manifesto that Jeffrey Snover wrote back in 2002, 2003, whatever it was. So we had the first version, had 137 commandlets. Your only remoting option was get WMI object. We struggled to get some stuff done, but it was an awful lot better than VBScript. Anybody work with VBScript? Yeah, don't you just love it? Then came V2, we got remoting, and everyone went hallelujah. Well, PowerShell jobs, I actually think in many respects they're a more powerful tool, even than remoting. And we got the ISC, the rest of the WMI commandlets, and we got modules and all the fun that they've brought. V3, we moved on to workflows, sim commandlets and sessions and so on. DSC, PowerShell classes in 5. And then the big one when we went open source. We get Linux and Mac. SSH remoting, which is an interesting thing, all of its own. 6.1 bug fixes and a few smaller things, though the thread jobs looks interesting. What's next? Anybody know? It's because it's your project. It's an open source project. If the community doesn't contribute, you're not going to get anything. And I'm going to keep coming back to that thing, because you need to get involved with the PowerShell project and tell them what you want. Even if you don't code it, comment and put up requests for extra functionality. There were a couple of things that never took off. Workflows, yeah, they're great, but they're a pain to use. Remembering that you're working with activities and not commandlets, just too confusing. And transactions. Anybody use PowerShell transactions? Nobody, exactly. It's only available on the registry provider. Why? The one thing that they missed that really, really should have been in there. All right, to work that off, I'll go back to some code. Anybody surprised that that works? So $A equals 2 A's, $B equals a single A, $A like $B is true. Yeah? You're not surprised by that. What about if you remove B and it still comes true? Why is that? B is null, so it goes back to 2 stars, and if you remember, a star is 0 or many characters. Again, just be careful. It's so easy to trip over these things. So we've seen where we've been, and there's a lot of history around PowerShell. But where are we going, and what do we need? We still need a good parallelization, and I think that's a word I've just made up, option. Workflows just didn't do it. You've got Posh RS Jobs, which has got a horrible name, even though it's got my initials in it, but it seems to do the job. It works on v6 and v5.1. It was written by Bo Prox, if I remember correctly. It's PowerShell MVP from the States, really good guy. Or you've got thread jobs in 6.1 as a possibility. There's a lot of talk on the project about what they're going to do for parallel execution. Nothing's been decided. Tell them what you want. It's your chance to get something done. Commander coverage on Linux. PowerShell on Linux sounds great, but what can you actually do with it? You've got no commandlets for working with network adapters, storage, anything like that. We need some commandlet coverage on Linux. I suspect that's going to have to come from the community, you guys. We probably need some more domain-specific languages, if you can think of the domain that they need it in. And how many, have you set up OpenSSH on Windows? Isn't it fantastic? Exactly. It needs to be easier. WinRM remoting is just there, or it's enabled PS remoting. It needs to be the same level. Again, it's your opportunity to input to PowerShell, nag them, get them to get it done. Innovation is something that isn't just new features in PowerShell. It's new ways of using the functionality that we've got. So, have you thought about using Pester for troubleshooting? How many of you done a network test? Ping the loopback adapter, ping your own IP, ping the default gateway, ping something else. Yeah? I bet there's nobody in the room hasn't done that. Set it up as a set of Pester tests. Boom, 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 boom. You don't have to. Have you done it?
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Come and tell them how it's done. New users for PowerShell. PowerShell's a great automation language, but it's useful for so many things. If you get the opportunity, I'm sorry to keep picking on you, James, but you're in the front row. Talk to James. He's done some fantastic things with managing his photo library. It's also great for working out how long it takes to cook a chicken. I can't do kilograms to pounds in my head. Where does the innovation come from? Give you one guess. These days, it's coming from you guys. Either stuff that you blog about, stuff that you put up into the gallery, stuff that you contribute to the project. The community has to drive PowerShell innovation, otherwise we're going to stagnate. Okay, this is a question to satisfy my curiosity. What's the predominant platform on which you use PowerShell? How many for Windows? Just about. Linux? That's the predominant platform. Sorry, how many we got? Oh, got a couple. Ah. Mac? Okay. Now, in terms of where we are going forward, or where we're going to go forward, I picked this up, and it is slightly out of context, but the intent is there. This was a comment, or part of a comment that Steve Lee from the PowerShell team put up in response to an issue on the project. The intent is not to have a V7. There's a lot of talk about a V7 and dropping backward compatibility and just basically being new. Reading that, if they stick with it, that's going to make life easier. There will be breaking changes. There have been breaking changes in v6, 6.1. If you follow the project, there are more coming, and I think it's inevitable that these things will come and bite us over time. But it's the price of progress and innovation. One of the things that the project team do is they've got a dashboard of a whole load of stuff about the v6 project. And this is one of the things that I thought was interesting, showing where v6 has been used. And it's predominantly on Linux. 2 or 3 Mac users and a few on Windows. Now, I can understand why there's a lot of people probably not using it on Windows, because we've got Windows PowerShell v5.1 or one of the earlier versions. Does the job. It's got great coverage. The v6 commandlet coverage isn't there, though with 6.1 and the fact that they now hook you up to the modules in system32./PowerShell helps cut down on the functionality gaps. Still can't use the Active Directory commandlets though. So this is important to think about, because from the v6.1 release notes, the telemetry is used to prioritize where development effort is put for new features and fixes. So if the majority of the users are on Linux, eventually you're going to end up with a PowerShell optimized for Linux. Is that going to help you guys if you're all working on Windows? No. Contribute. Get what you need. You do need to be involved with the project. Okay, the PowerShell community. Anybody want to give me 6 words or less on the state of the PowerShell community? Ryan?
Evolving and growing.
Evolving and growing. Okay, that's not bad. It's got a lot of strengths. And I think the openness is one of the key strengths of the PowerShell community. Right from the very, very beginning, the PowerShell team was involved from the community, and they still are to some extent. And they fought tooth and nail to keep the community open. I don't know whether you've looked at some other technical communities, but there are a number of them that are very closed. If you're not part of that little clique, forget it. You're not going to have any involvement. We've managed to avoid that for the most part, I think. And I think it's great that we've kept that openness. The numbers of people involved in the community, as Ryan said, seems to be growing. There's a lot of people supplying information. That's not just vendors, but there's MVPs, there's other experts, there's the user groups, there's the conferences, either like today or the Asia conference that was mentioned, the American Summit, and the European conference. Its greatest strength, to my mind, diversity. There are frequent attempts to centralize and create this big monolithic single entity. Don't fall for it. Keep it diverse. That's where the strength is. A single organization leads to groupthink and leads to stagnation. And how can people in the UK know what's going on in Singapore and what's needed there? People in London don't know what Nottingham needs, never mind somewhere different. Keep it diverse. And it's the community itself that needs to drive that diversity. So I think, Ryan, you said there's user groups, 3 or 4 user groups, I think, are picked up.
There's 6 now in the UK.
Excellent.
And growing.
Yeah, excellent. And the thing with user groups is that they will appear, they'll run for a while and then they'll disappear. And it's the nature of the beast. Other people will then come along, pick them up, and get them going again. And that's great because it feeds that diversity. It feeds that freshness. And that's what we need. So personally, I think the community is in a very strong position. I think it's well placed to go forward. And I think today is a prime example of that. And I think that if you can keep this sort of event going, you'll be doing fantastic. Okay. Good practice or bad practice? Pardon? Yeah. But will it work? Pardon? It shouldn't. It will. Because that's what it's actually doing. Positional parameters. That's why you don't use them in a script, because you look at that and you go, yeah. You look at that and it looks like somebody's writing in reverse Polish notation. Shh. You're not allowed to say that. And it actually makes a good interview question. If somebody can explain what's happening there, they understand what's going on. But it's all about positional parameters, because that's what you're actually doing. And PowerShell doesn't care about what order the parameters are in. So as long as you get the positional ones right, you can stop the rest around wherever. Now, somebody mentioned best practice. And that's actually a little bit of a bugbear of mine. So I'm going to put that up. Is there such a thing as best practice? Is there?
It's not a single point in time best practice. It's evolving. The very least for one person.
So evolving, changing, maybe for one person.
Not the same as other languages.
Beg pardon?
Not the same as other languages. For example, Python has an ISO standard. PowerShell doesn't.
So the other comment was about PowerShell doesn't have an ISO standard like Python. So I think that people can very easily agree what's good practice and what's bad practice. So putting aliases in scripts and that sort of thing. But what actually is best practice? And who decides what's best practice? You'll see a number of people saying, oh, the community decides that this is best practice. It's usually 2 or 3 people publishing what they think. It's not the community. Think of the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule. 20% of the effort gives you 80% of the results. So coding to some kind of best practice that somebody else has come up isn't necessarily going to work for you. Positional parameters we mentioned. Practice outputting objects, etc., etc. And then you get the typical conflicts about where you put your open braces. Is that a practice or is that a coding style? Yeah. So just out of curiosity, how many put open braces on the same line? How many put them on a new line? How many care?
I think people do what they were taught to do. And the braces on a separate line comes from an age when we used to look at our listings on great long sheet bits of fan from paper. So people who've been trained to go to that era tend to write code that's vertically longer.
So the comment there from James, if you didn't get it, was that it goes back to the days when you had huge listings and it was easier if everything was on a new line. Just from a personal aspect, the PowerShell in Action book that I did with Bruce Payette, I did the first draft of practically all of the chapters. And I'd send them off to Bruce. The chapters with functions in, he was quite happy with that, the opening brace being on the same line. classes, he wanted it on the new line. So, would anybody class that as good practice? Yeah. Unfortunately, there's still a load of code around like that because it's copied from what was around in VBScript and people just translated it without thinking. So you do something like that. And normally, I wouldn't actually do all of the calculated fields, but I just did it to match the what we had in the first one. A script analyzer doesn't like select. Wants it to be select object. ISE steroids, if you use that, will tell you the same. Interestingly, sorry to keep referencing this, but, the books, but it's where the examples come from. When I was doing my first PowerShell book, code, and things like this, I'd got select object, and he said, no, just use select. And telling me that I've got a problem because there's some trailing white space is a waste of my time. Okay. Again, a common pattern. Seen this quite a lot. It used to be how we had to do stuff. We've moved on a bit. The last scripting games we ran saw a lot of code like this. That's where you start cutting and pasting your comments because they see the same thing. So I would do something possibly like that. Or potentially like that. May use an ordered hash table because a lot of people whinge because they don't keep the order of properties. Does it really matter? Or I keep getting told to do that. If you can't see it, at the back, it's just creating a PS custom object directly in a hash table. Which of those is best practice? The bottom three, not the top one. Every time I use add member, I just want to add a single member onto an existing object. This is why I struggle with the concept of best practice. To my mind, any of those bottom three are good practice and get the job done. And that's what it comes back to all of the time, getting the job done. How many of you are employed just purely as PowerShell developers? 3, 4. How many of you use PowerShell to do something else? Yeah. And that's what your boss cares about. Have you solved my problem?
Yeah, but I just point out, if you're a PowerShell developer, you don't just write PowerShell, you have to have something to do with it as well.
All right, let me phrase it.
I don't just think it's worth to write PowerShell for a life.
Yeah. Don't you? Oh, sorry. Okay, it was badly phrased then. But the gist of it was, how many of you are using PowerShell to administer something or get something done, as opposed to primarily just writing code? In my view, and I'm quite happy to argue with this with anybody outside, sorry, that was more aggressive than I actually meant. To discuss over coffee or whatever. It's the job. What am I trying to achieve? It runs in a satisfactory time frame. Now, if something takes me an hour and I write a script that runs in 10 seconds, fine. Job done. I'm not going to spend any more time trying to make that run faster. There's a lot of discussion about, oh, I can shave half a second off this, or I can shave 0.1 of a second off this. You're wasting your time. Solve the other problem. So you've got. If you want to see a really, really good example of iteratively working through getting something to run faster, there was a session 2-3 years ago, Christy Lemaire at the European conference. She was loading millions of rows into a database table. And it went from hours to minutes I think she ended up using run spaces and doing something very clever with them. And I remember sitting in the session. It was the best session of that event, bar none. And it was very well organized and showed how to get the best out of stuff. And it should be easy to maintain and read and understand, because at some stage, you're going to chuck it to somebody else to work on. It's not going to be your code forever. How many people like giving their code to somebody else to work on? Ooh, I don't. I hate it. My code. Mine precious. OK, to sum that up, get it as good as it needs to be. By all means, and sorry, that's phrased badly. Make sure that you put in the right level of productionization, so that all the try-catch stuff, the error handling, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. My last job, the day I walked in, the guy sat behind me was muttering away because he'd got 28 Citrix servers to plow through the event logs looking for some particular event IDs. By the time he'd looked at one, I'd got permissions to have access to the servers, written the script to scan them, and told him how many events were on each server. That was a quick and dirty one-off that was half a dozen lines of code and would never be touched again. And the other way of looking at that, which I think is, that's your comment.
No, I got it from Jeffrey.
Mr. Snover,
Yeah.
he scores everywhere.
I quote it a lot, but no, I got it from Jeffrey.
But just think about how good, where is good enough for what you're trying to do? Now, if you look at the 5 guys in the front row here, I can't count. Each of those will have a different position in what is good enough to get their job done. None of those are wrong, because it's what they need to get done. And one last thought about where we're going. We've got DevOps that's been floating around, 10 years? Bunch of principles and a lot of cultural changes. I was just scanning through, and this was the post-DevOps. What comes next? Because IT always wants the next toy. It always wants the next big thing. Anti-DevOps was an interesting one. Basically, now we're going to chuck all that away and do something else. DevOps the whole business? Well, that could be fun. I'm sorry you can't do that. That's not the way we do that anymore. You're automated. Cloud ops, no ops, but it's still talking about automation. And I think the bottom line of all of this is wherever we go on that scale, or even if we're down here, automation is going to be a big driving force. 80% of an organization's costs are people. Now, the finance officers, for the most part, in most organizations, haven't cottoned on to automation. One of these days, they will. And IT departments are going to shrink even more. If you can automate what you're doing, that's how you keep your job. Not as I was in a meeting at HP years ago, and somebody actually said, "We don't have time to automate." Seriously, yeah. And if you hear the phrase, "That's how we've always done this," yeah, there's a few grins, and you've heard that. That's when you know you've got some problems. So the more you think about automating stuff, the more automation you do, the more automation you can bring to your organization, the better off you're going to be. Because if you're still working, you can still be driving the community. And I think the fact that you're here today and you've given up a day to come down to London to actually attend this just shows that you've got that interest and that you are an important part of the community. So just to pull everything together, 2 calls to action. If you're not already involved with the community, get involved. It doesn't have to be anything big, just teaching somebody PowerShell. Blogging, speaking. If you don't fancy getting up here and doing the keynote next year, it doesn't matter. There are other things you can do. I'm sure Ryan and Daniel and the other organizers would love help if you want to get involved that way.
So we are looking for help for organisers for the different user groups. If you want to start a user group in your city, let me know. I have some availability to travel to try and get one started. If you want to speak, we're doing lightning talks at various different groups over the course of the next year. Again, let me know. And if you want me to review a blog post before you are push it, let me know. I'll happily do that.
If anybody does start a user group, depending where it is in the country, I'm quite willing to come and speak or even do a session remotely. Contribute code to the gallery. Answer forum questions. That's a great way to get started. I can guarantee that people in this room are at the level that they can answer questions on the forums. Get involved with the PowerShell project. Try PowerShell V. Has anybody not tried PowerShell V6? Wow. Okay. Try it. Even if you stick it up on Windows. It will run most of the commandlets that are available under v5.1. So anything that is CDXML based, you'll know how that works. Commandlets over objects, wrapping sim classes in XML. They all seem to work. Things like the Hyper-V module that's compiled to be compatible with .NET Core. The biggie that doesn't work at the moment is the AD commandlets. There has been a demonstration, I believe, of them working under v6, so that's in the pipeline. Leave comments, discuss the issues, the RFCs, submit issues. It's your PowerShell. It's your community. The only way to drive it forward and keep it strong is to get involved. So, that. Any questions? They've taken the knife away, so it's safe to ask questions. So, is the Active Directory module open source? No, not at this time. Okay, the Microsoft, and this is me speaking as an outsider, I'm not speaking for them, but it appears that they're in the process of moving a bunch of stuff from proprietary to open source. So they've moved PowerShell core engine, they've moved a bunch of the modules. There is talk of others going open source. They're not there yet. The thing that you've got to remember about Microsoft is that they are a bunch of silos. It's not one big business. There's a lot of silos of activity. The teams don't necessarily talk to each other like any other organization. And the Active Directory team actually produced the Active Directory module. So it's up to them to make that move. It's not all focused on the PowerShell team. So open sourcing PowerShell and all of its modules, I think, should be regarded as a work in progress. Whether everything will be open sourced, it's difficult to tell. There's that fantastic commandlet, which I can never get the name right. The one where you can take the string output and chop it up and turn it into objects, convert from string data. That's not in, convert from string. That's not in v6 because it was partially produced with the Microsoft Research Labs, and they've not released it. So it's part A talking to part B and getting all of the ducks in a row to make it so. Eventually, My suspicion is that the majority of it will end up open source, but that is just my suspicion and hope. If you look at v6.1, they've brought back the ADSI accelerator and ADSI searcher accelerator. So you can go back to the Active Directory scripting that we did in v1. Yay, that's progress. Any other questions? Yes, Ryan.
What's your favourite part about PowerShell 6?
My favorite part about PowerShell 6. Setting up SSH, yeah. Yeah. My wife leaves the room when I start to do that. It's an interesting, it's got easier. I will be fair. It has got much easier over the iterations. Favorite part of PowerShell 6? I think thread jobs. I know that only came in 6.1, but I think that is actually a really great idea. If you've not seen it, you know you've got PowerShell jobs, and when you run a job, it spawns off a new process, and each job runs in its own process, so if one crashes, the rest keep going. That's really, really heavy in terms of resources that the machine needs. What thread jobs does is spawns off a new thread, so all of the jobs are running in the same process, which is much, much lighter activity, which is really good for some things. The drawback is if one of those threads crashes, it brings down everything. So it's that trade-off between stability and resources that you've got to manage. But yeah, I think at the moment, probably the thread jobs. And the fact that they've got a lot of, to the point where a lot or the majority of modules will work. And they've automatically added the System 32 modules in. My least favorite part is the fact that they've added that working directory parameter in 6.1 because it's set to your home thing automatically. So if you, in your profile, if you try to switch to a particular directory, sometimes I can never remember which way around it. If you run as an administrator, it will work, and if you run not as an administrator, it won't work, or the other way around. But you need to modify the working directory, which is a pain, but it's what we live with. Any more questions? Sorry.
The PowerShell analyzer, is there anyone or anything sort of governing what they should and should not be being incorrect?
It's basically, it's subjective in terms of how loud people shout. The more you shout about things, the more the rules will change. You can override the rules, you can drop rules out, you can, I think you can add your own rules in as well. The same with IC steroids. You can modify how they work. It's the fact that most people don't, they just take what comes out of the box. But if you're going to use any of those sorts of things, just be aware that somebody wrote those rules and they may not agree with, or you may not agree with how they're set, and work around them.
I've had some talks with them about, I find in a lot of my code, the detection for whether a variable is used after it's been declared is very, very poor.
Yeah.
Basically, if you've got something inside a script block where you set a variable, it's about accessible to the rest of the script, but they kind of go, no, this is isolated. You've used it once, and you've never used it again. And I get so many false positives from that rule that, and the answer comes back, well, yes, it's too hard to detect it properly.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think at that point, it's a rule that is actually causing more problems than it's actually solving. If you didn't catch it, it's basically variables that are declared and not used, and how they're detected, and the fact that a lot of the analyzers are poor at doing that and they haven't got a way to fix it. So be careful with analyzing your script. It may not give you the results you thought. If you're developing stuff, set strict mode on while you're developing it. That will save you a lot of grief. And then take it off when you're running. Any more questions? Yes, sir. What's next for me? I'm in the process of retiring. I have been in the process of retiring for the last 3 years. I just wound up working on a Hyper-V book, and I'm probably going to do another PowerShell book, and hopefully a bit more speaking. Any more? Because we're just about on time. Last one.
Just mentioned spec mode. I never actually used it before. Why would you not use it? Why would you want to turn it off?
Because it can hiccup. And hiccuping while you're developing and testing is one thing. Hiccuping in production, not quite such a good thing. Yeah. And it was, those words came from Bruce Piatt, and he knows more about PowerShell than anybody, I think. Okay, possibly James Truer. If you don't know Bruce and James, they're the two guys who actually designed the language originally. Very, very clever guys. If you ever get the chance to talk to them, take it. All right, we're on time, or just about over time, so I think we'll wrap that up. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and I hope to see you in my sim session this afternoon. Thank you.